Hello and welcome back to this our 40th live stream, the Indefinite Extended Idiom. What we are talking about here is the number 40 in Egyptian and Semitic cultures, which represented essentially a extended, long, or indefinite number of things. Like, for example, you might say 40 years when you might mean 60 years or 20 years, and basically an undefined extended long period of time. And this is actually a pretty common idiom in, say, even the Bible. We find it in the Moabite stela, and we also find it just in Semitic culture in general. So it's a very, very interesting idiom, but it is an idiom, which means you can't interpret it exactly by the literal words. So, with that said, we're going to start getting into the questions today. And it's the same as always, where super chats have priority. If you're not going to ask a super chat, but still want to ask a question, I ask that you put a Q and a colon in front of the question. Only post the question once. So, because I do scan through it. We also ask that if you do a question regarding a Bible verse or a word in a foreign language, please specify either the where I can find the verse, so it's easy for me to look up, or basically what you think the word means, so I have a little bit of context. Because frankly, this happened to me today, where somebody asked me about an Egyptian word, and I couldn't recognize the spelling because it was spelled incorrectly. So I'd ask, well, what do you mean by this? And it's like, oh, you mean this. So giving me a little context can help me answer the questions better. So with that said, let's get into it. We have got actually a lot of really technical questions tonight already. So this should be really exciting, and I'm actually really looking forward to this, because this is going to be, I think, very, very interesting. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with first 3 non-super chats, and I think they're all great. So first one here is from Chow Yi. Good evening, Dr. Falk. What do you think about the interpretation of Cain and Abel representing the clash between sedentary and nomadic pastor's cultures? Yeah, it's a perfectly bona fide interpretation. Now, we do have to understand and recognize that essentially with the first human beings, that in a sense, the first human beings are going to be, in many respects, archetypes. They're going to represent broader concepts because they're basically there first. So, Cain and Abel, representing the clash between sedentary and nomadic pastors' cultures, does make a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense for the Israelites coming out of Egypt too, because they're leaving a sedentary lifestyle, because they were all grouped in around the cities of Varus. So they were essentially farmers. They were sedentary farmers. And then they're leaving Egypt for a pastoralist lifestyle in Canaan. So absolutely, this makes a lot of sense. This interpretation makes a lot of sense, especially given the context of the Israelites as they leave Egypt. So it's a great question. I think it's a perfectly bona fide interpretation of it. Yeah, absolutely. I generally agree with this interpretation for the most part. So thank you very much for the question. It's a great question. Okay. The second question is from 501 Mobius. Really good, and again, really good question. Any idea how old Joshua was at the start of Exodus? Caleb says he was 40 in the second year. Now, we don't actually know how old Joshua was at the beginning of the Exodus. We are told he lived to I think it was 110 years, I think, is how long he lived, or 111. I'm not sure which one or the other. But we don't know. It's kind of like looking at a candle and trying to figure out, well, how long has that candle been burning? You don't know. So we don't really know how old he was at the time of the Exodus. We do know that he had to be at least 12. He had to be at least 12 years old at the time of the Exodus. And the reason why he has to be at least 12 was because he was sent as a spy 1 year later, which means he would have had to have been at least 13 at the time. And with the infiltration into Canaan happening 1 year after the Exodus, it means that Joshua would have had to have been at least 12 at the time during the Exodus. But we're not sure. He might have been older, certainly, but he had to be at least 12. So anyway, that's the best we can do with that one, because we just don't have enough other information to go on. So anyway, it's a good question. Thank you very much for the question. Great question. Okay. Third question comes from non-superchat, comes from Mr. Rich B.O.B. What is your informed opinion on the locusts in Revelation 9? Are they creatures similar from Egyptian myth? They seem to me to tread the line of literal and symbolic, distantly similar to Genesis 1. Okay. What I think the locusts are, I think they are demonic entities. Essentially, former cherubim, seraphim, and other basically spirit beings that fell, were twisted, and imprisoned. Essentially imprisoned. Until they are released and just sort of let go upon the general population. Now, the reason why I think they're these former spiritual, say, angelic beings, is because a lot of them carry very leonine characteristics. And when you start seeing leonine characteristics in basically when it refers to like spiritual beings, you have to think cherubim. You have to think cherubim. And what we see in Revelations 9 is very leonine in form. Not exactly. There's subtle differences, which shows you that these are, these things have been twisted beyond their original created form. But those leonine characteristics are, in a sense, analogical. They are symbolic in certain ways, but there's also something literal underlying all that too. Because cherubim aren't really leonine beings, but they're often described as such. Because they are, they're ferocious. They are very powerful beings. So that's what's sort of trying to be communicated here in Revelation 9. That these creatures aren't similar to anything we find really in Egyptian myth. And in some respects, not even similar to what we find in other ancient Near Eastern myths either. They go beyond that. There's something happening beyond that, and it's a very apocalyptic description, which means John is taking from many different sources here to try to capture what he saw in the Revelation. So anyway, that's probably the best I can answer that question here. It's a good question, but that's what I think it is that these are fallen spirits. Okay. Well, that covers our 3 non-super chats for the beginning of the broadcast. Let's get into the super chats now. Okay, and first super chat is from Brick Creation for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Brick Creation has got several super chats to begin with, like he always does, and frankly, I am actually really grateful he does, because he's going to ask some really, really technical questions. So, because he gave these questions before we went live, I was able to adequately prepare for them. Not so much for this one, but for the next 2, definitely. So, Brick Creation is really stepping up his game here and trying to get his money's worth. So, I can't fault him for that. So anyway, he asks, "Hi, Dr. Falk. Do you think Magog in Ezekiel 38 is Russia, and that the kings of the east in Revelation 16:12 is referring to China and the surrounding nations. Is the Euphrates River drying up significant? So many questions, sorry. Well, you are giving me a great, generous super chat here, so no need to apologize. Let's take the last one first. Is the Euphrates River drawing significant? It is only that it's letting you know that the way is opening up. That's really the only thing that's significant here, is that the way is opening up, because the Euphrates is a natural barrier, and it has been for many armies in the past. Essentially, the Euphrates is a wide, slow-moving river. So if you are coming from the east, you have to cross the Euphrates at some point in order to get to Megiddo or to the Levant. So that is a natural barrier. And if you're moving a very, very large army, that could be quite an impediment. So it is significant that it is drying up, only in that it allows for that movement of a very, very large land. Now, your second question, your previous question, is really two parts. Do the kings of the east refer to China and surrounding nations? This is tough to say. Generally, when you're talking about the east and biblical geography, you're really talking about Mesopotamia. You're talking about Iran, Iraq, and if you really stretch it, Elam and India. Elam more than India even. So China really wasn't on their radar. China wasn't on their radar. So they are really referring to sort of Mesopotamia. That's what the East means to a biblical geography. And the fact is that the kings of the East here is multiple. It's not just one king, it's many kings. It's a coalition. In many respects, this is hearkening back to Genesis 14, the War of Kings, where the Elamite Akkad coalition under Amraphel basically, invaded the Levant, during the time of Abraham. So that's really what's being sort of referenced here. This is a reference to Genesis 14. So there's that idea that this is a coalition. This is a coalition of kings. This isn't just, say, one big nation like China. This is a coalition of kings, basically a collection of smaller kings that are uniting to come to war. So that's what's being referred to in Genesis 16:12. Now, Magog in Ezekiel 38 is probably a reference to Western Turkey. We find it being referred to as Gugu in the Akkadian records of Ashurbanipal. It's also there's also a king called Gyges who ruled Western Lydia at the time, so that's still Western Turkey. So there's a lot there that sort of narrows it down to sort of that Western Turkey region, which we would call maybe Troy. So I don't think that's Russia. If it had been Russia, we would probably see something more along the lines of Erat, because that was also a known location. So I don't think that this is a reference to, say, Russia per se. Yeah, I know that's very, very popular in newspaper eschatology. But it doesn't quite fit the geography. The geography would be more in line, if it was Russia, you would see more along as Urartu. Because that's the Caucasus area. That's something more in line with what they would have sort of envisioned Russia to be. This is more of say, the Hittites, or say Turkey as it was, Anatolia. Particularly Western Anatolia. So anyway, it's a great super chat. Interesting questions. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, now the second super chat is also from Brick Creation for $10. Thank you very much. And this is the one this and the next one, I'm really glad he gave me some heads up on this because this is very technical. Okay, so we're getting into some deep stuff here. And he asks, is there a solution for the late Exodus from scripture such as 1 Chronicles 6:33, and I think you mean 19, generations from Moses to Solomon? Okay. Now, I'm not going to read the passage is actually 1 Chronicles 6:33 to 38. But I'm not going to read that because what I've done is I've actually prepared a graphic instead that visually shows the genealogy. And this is what we're going to talk about. So this is the 19 generations, actually 18 technically. The 19th generation comes after Haman, and it would be Solomon. So essentially, the way the argument goes, and this is an argument actually, I can tell from your questions that you've been either reading or listening to Roger Young, because this is Roger Young's argument. And for those who don't know, Roger Young is affiliated with the Associates for Biblical Research, which I've talked about many times on this channel. Basically, an organization that supports the early date of the Exodus. I've actually gone toe-to-toe with Roger on one occasion. He's not an ancient Near Eastern historian. He has no qualifications in the ancient Near East. He does have a PhD in mathematics. Okay, so he's got a PhD in an unrelated area. Now that doesn't disqualify his qualifications, but it should. We are going to get into some things here where his stuff doesn't quite work. Now the way this argument works, is he basically, looks at the genealogy of Haman from Levi going to Haman, which is contemporary with King David. And then one more generation, Solomon. So they're going to say that Korah is contemporary with Moses. He's the generation of Moses. And if you count the generations from Korah to Haman, you get 18 generations. You count Solomon, you get 19 generations. 19 times 25 equals 475. That's incredibly close to the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1. Therefore, this is pointing to the 1446 date of the Exodus, ergo, the early date of the Exodus. Okay. So, we're going to have to ask a few questions about this. There's going to be some probing questions here. Now, the first probing question is, well, how do they get the idea that Korah is contemporary with Moses? Well, what they do is they look at the genealogy of Moses in Exodus 6, and they see that the genealogy of Moses goes from Levi to Kohath to Amram, and then to Moses. So they figure from that Moses is the third generation, Korah's the third generation, they're the same generation. Okay. So that's how they arrive at their argument. So they establish that Korah is the Moses generation, and then generation after Haman is the Solomon generation. And then they do their simple math from there. However, there's some problems here. And the first problem comes in Exodus 6:24. And I'm going to just Bible here. Exodus. Okay, where it talks about the sons of Korah. And this is the Exodus. And the sons of Korah, Asir and Elkanah and Abiasaph, these were the families of the Korahites. Now, people often gloss over this, but the term family here actually means clan. Now, clan has a very specific definition. The word clan means that you have 4 generations living simultaneously at the same time. So it's essentially saying that the patriarchs of these clans are Asir, Elkanah, and Abiasaph. So then if we go back our generations, one of the things we are going to notice is that if Abiasaph is, say, the eldest of the clan members, that means that Abiasaph, Asir, Tahath, and Zephaniah were all alive at the time of the Exodus. That is going to cut off some generations right there. But it's even more problematic than that. Because if these 4 generations were alive at the time, that also means that a generation is potentially even less than 25 years. That's going to cut off a lot of that sort of generational sort of calculation. But it gets even worse. It gets even worse for them here. And the reason is because of 1 Samuel 1:1. And 1 Samuel 1:1 reads, "Now there was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite." Here is the problem. The problem is that the generations of Zuph through Samuel are actually copied from 1 Samuel 1:1. So we know from 1 Samuel 1:1 that Samuel was not a Levite. He was an Ephraimite. So Haman is not related to Levi in any way, shape, or form. He is not actually a descendant. So what we have here is actually a grafted genealogy. So what exactly is going on here? So this is going to there's a lot going on here. But what's going on here is that we have is probably the best way to explain this is, let's say you wanted to honor somebody for their past service. In this particular case, Samuel. Now, Samuel was an Ephraimite. Yet he served in the tabernacle. And that's because Eli's posterity were completely morally bankrupt. And all the sons of Eli, including Eli himself, all the sons were killed, except for the youngest grandson, which was like 2 years old. So that the house of Eli had no more men. And they could no longer serve in the tabernacle. There was no man that was capable of serving in the tabernacle. So for a time, Samuel had to do tabernacle service in the stead of a Levite. And he did it faithfully. So basically what's happening here is the descendants of Samuel are being grafted into the Levites, even though they're not actually related to the Levites. So they're being made honorary Levites so that they can continue to serve in the tabernacle. And because they can serve in the tabernacle, they can also now serve in the temple. So Haman is being allowed to serve in the temple and his posterity because it is honoring the service that Samuel did. But it's not because they're actual blood Levites. But there's this sort of, and I hate to use this, but religious fiction. It's kind of like an honorary degree. You're not, like an honorary doctorate, you're not really a doctorate. You don't really hold a doctorate if you have an honorary doctorate, but you're being honored as if you have one. In the same way, Haman is not really a Levite, but he's being honored because of Samuel's posterity as though he were one. So that's what's going on here. This has consequences, though, when we start talking about trying to do hating from this, which is we don't know, because this is a grafted genealogy, it may not be 19 generations or 18 generations. It could be a lot shorter. We know just from, say, Exodus 6 with the clan structure that it has to be shorter. So I think this argument really, really fails, honestly, because it's not taking the Bible in its context. Now, we have to also say, too, though, that no one's being fooled by this, by the way. Back in ancient times, the Israelites knew their genealogy. I mean, we have to also consider that genealogies were the entertainment of the day. People didn't go to the movies back then. They told stories about people's genealogies, because attached to genealogies are stories. So the ancient Israelites knew their genealogies back and forward. They would have known Heman, Joel, Samuel were Ephraimites. They would have known it. So no one's actually being fooled by this. Well, as I said, what it is they're being made honorary Levites for the purposes of being able to service. So anyway, very complicated question, but also very interesting question. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Now, your next super chat is actually no less complicated. Brick Creation for $50. Thank you very much for the super chat. Did you read Roger Young's argument against the late date Exodus using Ezekiel 41, which suggests a jubilee in 574 BC, 17th jubilee, and counting back to the first jubilee, 16 jubilees times 49, will lead to 1406 BC. Does this have merit? Okay. Now, it doesn't. It doesn't have merit, but it's a little complicated. Now, the way this argument works is he's actually going to the Talmud. He doesn't get this from the Bible. He gets this from the Talmud. Essentially, the Seder Olam Robah, which in Archaeology 12a basically says that Ezekiel 41 was a Jubilee year. And he's right about that. It was a Jubilee year, based upon the New Year being in the 10th day of the month. And then he gets a piece of information from Archaeology 12b saying that there were 17 Jubilees. So he figures, okay, the 17th Jubilee is in 570 BC. The 16th Jubilee is in 1622. So he multiplies 16 by 49 to get 784 years. He adds that to 662 BC to get 1406 BC. Add another 40 years for the Wanderous Wildings, and you get 1446 BC. And it just happens to be exactly the calculation they get from 1 Kings 6:1. That's the argument in a nutshell. Okay. Now, this has certain problems. Let's actually, what we should do is we're going to bring up the primary source text. Imagine that. Let's go to the primary source, which is Archaeology 12b, which reads, Rabbi Yehuda says, for the first time, referring to the destruction of the temple, you do not find a teaching that there were 17 jubilees from when Israel entered Israel until they left. The first Israel, referring to Jacob, or the Israelites, sorry. So you cannot say that they entered from that time, because if you did, it means that the temple was destroyed at the beginning of a jubilee. But do you not find that in the 14th year after the city was smitten? Ezekiel 40, verse 1. Okay, so that's the reading of Archaeology 12b. Now, there's some issues here. Now, if this text is saying that 17 cycles took place between the destruction of the temple, just taking the rabbi saying that the 17 cycles happened between the destruction of the temple to the Israelite conquest, then it is actually 17 cycles plus 35 years that took place before the destruction. Because, Rabbi Yehudis is saying that this is not how many there was. So if we take just that alone, the Talmud would be saying then that Ezekiel's Jubilee is not the 17th, but the 18th. In which case, Roger Young's count is off by 49 years alone. But there's something even more problematic about this. The fact is that the text is not saying that there were 17 Jubilee cycles. It's saying, this is what this is it's an argument between two rabbis. The first rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda, is essentially saying that there is no 17 Jubilee cycle teaching, because if there were, the destruction would have the temple would have ended up during a Jubilee year. So that's why it wasn't. Why there's no such teaching as that. And the second rabbi, who's not named here, is essentially saying, no, that's not the reason there's no 17-year teaching. The reason there's no 17th year teaching is because of Ezekiel 41, which basically says that, in Ezekiel 40, the Jubilee year is identified as 14 years after the fact. Essentially, we have two rabbis squabbling over the reason why there's no 17-year teaching. They're not agreeing on the reason for the teaching. They both agree that there is no 17-year teaching. They're just squabbling over the reason why there's no 17-year teaching. This is very, very typical of Talmudic literature. And we have to kind of understand, too, that this was put to pen around 500 AD. Nobody is, at this point, this is 1,000 years after the events took place. Anyone who's using this to try to do chronology is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, is just not firmly attached to reality here. Because the Talmud gets so much wrong that it's not really a reliable source in these sort of matters. But with that said, however, does Roger Young have any other evidence to suggest that there were 17 Jubilee cycles? And the answer is no. There is not a shred of any other evidence other than two rabbis denying that such a teaching exists. So, I don't think this argument has merit in the slightest. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. It was a long question and a long explanation, but a very, very complicated technical question. Okay. So, super chat number 4. From Brick Creation again for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Sorry, no more hard questions for tonight. When the temple is rebuilt by the Temple Institute, would you plan on visiting? Oh boy. Boy. Let me put it like this. The Temple Institute has been trying to push for the rebuilding of the third temple, essentially since the 1980s. They're no closer today than they were 30 years ago. 30, 40 years ago. They're just yeah, they keep collecting money for their cause, but they're no closer. They're no closer. And I do think that the temple will be rebuilt one day. But I don't think the Temple Institute is going to have much of a say in it, to be honest. They'd like to be involved. They've got furniture that they'd like to put in its place should it happen, but I really, really doubt that they're going to be much involved in the slightest. Now, Would I go and visit? That's a great question. The question would be, well, first of all, they would not recognize me as a Jew anyway. So I doubt that they would even let me near, say, the inner court. So but maybe I might go give a Thanksgiving offering. Maybe, it's possible. Once that temple is up, certain aspects of the ceremonial law are back in play again, and one of those is Thanksgiving offerings. So, yeah, possible. I won't go over there, religiously, but might be interesting. Even just to see it might be interesting. There's many places I go to see that are just interesting to see. So, but but I wouldn't make more of it than that. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Next super chat is from 501 Mobius for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. When the Hyksos are driven out of Egypt, where did they go? They went to Gaza. And if it was the Levant, why didn't the Israelites encounter them when they conquered the Promised Land? Well, here's the reason why. They, around 1538 BC, the Hyksos abandon Avaris, and they basically hightail it out to Gaza. And what happens is, Ahmose I comes in, he smashes Avaris, he takes the people, enslaves the people, and he's really, really upset. He's really angry that the Hyksos left town and took all the goodies with them. So 3 years later, in 1535, Ahmose I goes on campaign, and then he goes to Gaza and he destroys it. He smashes it and kills all the leadership. And that's the end of the Hyksos. That's the final. That's the end of the Hyksos right there. They don't actually. The fact is, they didn't run far enough. They did not run far enough. Gaza was just close enough to Egypt that that Ahmose could follow them all the way there. So it was not a good ending for the Hyksos. And after Ahmose I destroys Gaza, that's pretty much the end of the Hyksos. That's really why the Israelites don't encounter them, is because the Israelites are coming in through across the Jordan River into the Judean foothills from the east. Gaza is on the west. It's on the west at sort of that elbow of the coastal plain. And frankly, the Israelites are not going to penetrate that big swamp that runs down the center of Canaan and inhabit the coastal plain. You'll have like Naphtali and Dan inhabit the coastal region at the north of the coastal plain, but they never make it south. So even if the Hyksos had survived, they would have never encountered. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and it's a good question. Okay. Those are all the pre-existing super chats. Let's get here to the pre-existing one. Okay. Sa'ahi Heather Newt, thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you for the super chat. It's always great to see you here. You can't just dangle a fun Giza holiday story over a devotee of Hathor's head. Wink, wink. Not sure what you mean here by fun Giza holiday story. You'll have to be a little more specific. There's a lot of holidays in Egypt, even in modern times. So I need a little more information, a little more context here. I'm always game for fun Giza holiday stories. My one recollection of a holiday was I was actually in Giza during the celebration of Eid, and wow, that was interesting. That was really, really interesting. I didn't stay for Eid because I had to leave on my flight for Eid. But I was there up to the lead up to Eid, and you would see these shepherds. I mean, Giza's a built up city. It's a big city of 8 million people. I mean, it's not small. Um, and you saw similar sites in Cairo too. But they were shepherds were going door to door, selling lambs to be sacrificed for Eid. And you would see these live lambs being dragged up these staircases up to the upper stories of these apartments. I mean, oh, okay. All right. She clarifies. And you had mentioned one last Q&A, and I think you're answering now. Laugh out loud. Well, there's lots of festivals in ancient Egypt, lots of them, and one I mentioned last was essentially a festival that took place at Medina Habu. So, and actually, that is dedicated that festival where they people got time off at Medina Deir el Medina from work to actually celebrate was actually not to worship Hathor, but to worship Amenhotep I, which is the patron god of Deir el Medina. He's also the second pharaoh of Dynasty 18. But the reason why they venerated him as a god was because, and had festivals to him, was because everyone at Deir el Medina owed their livelihoods to him. He's the one that started the Valley of the King. So, getting back to the Eid story, you got to see these shepherds go door to door, selling live sheep to a variety to average people. And it was very, very interesting to see them, do the exchange of money and then push this reluctant sheep up a staircase. Fascinating to watch. A little comical too, as sometimes the sheep kind of got away from them. Yeah, kind of sad if you're the sheep, but very fun to watch. So anyway, that's my holiday story from Giza. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. Linguist Ammo for $1.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. And I do see a question below there, so we'll get to that question too. Which is, good evening. I just wanted to know your thoughts on the settlement period put forth by Pitcairn in the book Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament. Okay, I haven't read his view. I have the book. Yes, I know. I'm published in that book, but honestly, I haven't read the whole thing yet. So, in my copious free time, I need to do more reading. So I don't know what he says there in there, but so I'm gonna have to plead ignorance here. Haven't read it, so I should read it. I haven't read it, and you have my deepest apologies for not reading it, because I really should read that book because I'm in it. I should read, and the reason why I should read it is because I should be familiar with what my contemporaries are also saying. So, you've hit a lacuna here. So, again, I'm sorry, but I just don't know. But thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate the question. Okay, Bibliotheca Historica for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. I've heard it claimed that Tanis was in a particularly devastated condition when discovered. Is this actually true? If so, why? It wasn't really... The thing we have to understand about temples and palaces is when they're neglected, they fall down. Now, there's some exceptions to this. We have a few temples that are particularly well preserved, like Dendera. Like Edfu. In the case of Dendera, what happened is it's actually in a depression. Dendera's actually in a depression. and that whole depression got filled with sand up onto the roof. So even the roof was covered to some extent with sand. When they first discovered Dendera, nobody knew there was a temple underneath that depression. And they started, digging it out and discovered a hole in the roof. And oh, look, there's a temple down below. So Dendera is an example of an exceptionally well-preserved temple because it had been filled in. Most temples aren't like this. Most temples essentially fall apart from neglect. You get subsidence, you get flooding that moves around the foundation earth, and they fall down. So, looking at Tanis, and I've been there. I've been to Tanis. It's no worse than a lot of temples I've seen. A lot of the stonework has been hauled away. Probably for other building projects, and that's pretty typical too, is that stones do tend to get recycled in Egypt. It's easier to recycle a stone than to quarry a new one. Now, we don't know where the Tanis stones went, but it looks like a fair number of them were hauled away after the city fell into disuse. But we do find a lot still there. So I don't think it was particularly devastated. I think it was more picked apart. I think that's probably a better way to put it, is that the temple at Tanis was more or less picked apart. And it was a capital, so there was many surrounding buildings too. So it's not just that it wasn't a matter of the city just being destroyed. It was more or less it fell apart. It fell apart. So I'd say no more than any other city, and no more than any other temple. But that's just based upon what I know of Tanis. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. This is just what happens to temples, when they fall into disuse, they fall apart. Temples require constant maintenance to stay in tip-top condition, just like a house. You abandon a house, it falls apart. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Cataphract3 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. How much would the common Egyptian have known or believed about the afterlife? Any evidence the Israelites picked up any Egyptian ideas about that? Yes, absolutely. Okay. The first question. The common Egyptian would have actually known a fair bit about the afterlife. Maybe not as much as a priest would. But we have to remember that these are their stories. When they're sitting around a fire, there's a long tradition in Egypt where people discuss things. Egypt's kind of a boring place if you don't sit around the fire, drinking your beer. Today they drink tea, but and I've been part of these discussions. In Egypt, where you'll sit with a couple of old guys around a fire, and you're sipping tea. It's 9 o'clock at night. It's pitch black. You're sitting around a fire. You're sipping tea, and you're talking about Solomon and David and Ramses and all these different people of the ancient past. They did the same thing. The ancient Egyptians did exactly the same thing. Except they're talking about Amun-Re, and they're talking about Hathor, and they're talking about Sobek. They're talking about Osiris. These are their legends. These are their stories. They're going to be talking about maybe some of the notorious kings, such as Khufu and his escapades, or Jedi. So, your common Egyptian would have had actually quite an array of knowledge about the afterlife, just because they're telling these stories over and over and over again. It's part of their shared heritage. So they would have had a very, very wide exposure to these things. And we do see this too, that your typical Egyptian, carries around amulets of these various gods. They carried amulets of Osiris and of Amun, Amun-Re, and of Anubis. So they had knowledge of the afterlife. Your middle class would have been mummified, and they definitely would have had knowledge of the afterlife. So it was a trickle-down thing. The priests had more knowledge and more access, but middle class also knew, and they would have shared it with the commoners as well. So absolutely, definitely would have been known. As far as the Israelites picking up Egyptian ideas about that, yes, they also did. We do have evidence to that extent. For example, in Genesis 1, it does seem to pick up. There is this idea of that God, creates from thinking it and then speaking it with his voice, and this is very, very reminiscent of the Memphite theologies. We also too have evidence that they have picked up, say, the idea that man was made from the clay, on new theology. So there are Egyptian ideas that the Bible puts its rubber stamp on. Basically says, yeah, these are the right ideas. So we do have evidence for this. So absolutely. And I think that the Israelites would have picked up a notion of the afterlife from the Egyptians. Now, the question of the afterlife is that while the Torah doesn't make a huge deal of the afterlife, that's not to say that the Israelites didn't have those ideas. In fact, it's almost inevitable that they would have had those, just because of the cultural pool of ideas that they were living at the time. The fact is too that also they say the Torah is very, very much more focused on how we live in this life. So because it's more focused in how we live on this life, it's sort of less focused on the afterlife. But again, the ideas that that they would have had just from the cultural milieu would have necessitated a belief in the afterlife. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Interesting question. Very, very interesting question. Okay. Moses Salazar for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hello, Dr. Folk. What do you think about the Galileo trial? I think I need a shot of whiskey for this. My opinion, he says, is that it has been misrepresented, leaving out experimental versus Aristotelian point of view. Okay. Here is my opinion of the Galileo trial. My opinion of the Galileo trial is that this is a textbook example of an extra biblical science being grafted onto the Bible, having a party at the Bible's expense, being disproven, and leaving the Bible holding the bag. Essentially, what was before Galileo the sort of the dominant view of astronomy was Ptolemaic astronomy, basically owed to the Alexandrian astronomer Ptolemy. That basically said that the Earth was the center and the planets and the sun rotated in spheres around the Earth. When Copernicus and Galileo came along, essentially, that was disproven. But the problem is, during the trial, it wasn't a well, this is say modern observations versus Ptolemaic astronomy. It became a trial of well, this is they doubled down on this, and they said, well, this is a trial between, say, modern, observations of Galileo and Copernicus versus the teaching of the church. And I think that was terribly irresponsible of the prosecutors of the trial to do. Terribly irresponsible. And frankly, the church has never lived it down. We've never lived it down. We're still contesting this point today, because this is not a view that is endemic to the Bible. It's not a view that we find in the Bible. It's a view from Ptolemaic astronomy that's essentially was grafted on because it was the accepted science of the day. So, this one sort of boils my blood, because I think it's often misrepresented as being, well, this is the Bible's view versus Galileo's view, and it's not. This is Ptolemy's view versus Galileo's view. But this is the problem with, say, taking any modern science, whether it's evolution, whether it's Big Bang Theory, whether it's Ptolemaic astronomy, whether it's phlogiston, and basically putting the biblical rubber stamp on this, is because science changes. It always has changed. It might take 1,500 years to change, but it often changes. And this is the problem. This is the problem with putting a biblical rubber stamp on something and saying, "Hey, this is what the Bible teaches." Because as soon as the idea is disproven, then it's the Bible ends up holding the bag, not the crappy theory that started it all. It's just foolishness. This is why I don't get into the creationism evolution debate, is because they both could be wrong, and the rug could be pulled out of either one of them. And then then the Bible's holding the bag again. In the case of creationism, the science is surely wrong. And in evolution, the science is probably wrong. And the reason why I say the science is probably wrong is because it's changed every 50 years. Every 50 years, the theory of evolution goes through a dramatic change. We're on 4th generation evolutionary theory today. There's going to be a 5th generation and a 6th generation, and it's just going to go on. It will, don't hitch the Bible to this stuff. It's temporary. It's ephemeral. Because if you hitch the Bible to these things, I mean, it's no different than hitching the Bible to this newspaper prophecy that we discussed earlier. Because you don't know. Because you don't know, it's just going to end up in tears. It's just going to end up in tears with people doubting their faith. And it just ends up bad for everyone. It ends up bad for the believers. It ends up bad for the disbelievers because it gives them a reason to mock. It's just terrible. And I do get very worked up over it. Because I've seen this play out over and over and over. I think, say, for example, creationism has created more atheists than we can even imagine. And frankly, theistic evolution, it doesn't have much better of a track. So, I'm well past jaded on this stuff. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the Galileo trial. Thank you very much for the super chat. I do appreciate it, and I hope that answered your question. Okay. Matthew Harrell for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Hi, Dr. Falk. I hope all is well. Well, it's been a pretty good week. Thank you very much for asking. I am considering buying a book called Egyptian Demons and Exorcism Papyri, but it is expensive. Are these papyri helpful for lay Christians to understand Near Eastern context. I don't know the book, honestly. I would have to. I'd have to know who published it. I'd have to know who the author was. You know, there are some of these that are better than others, but without knowing the source and who's behind it all, I really can't say one way or the other if the author's any good. I am familiar with most of the authors who write in Egyptology, so having a little more to go on might be helpful here. But at the same time, too, a lot of these papyri, some of them are helpful, some of them are not. Some of them are very sort of esoteric. There is definitely a tradition of exorcism in ancient Egypt, and that's true. We do see it more towards the Ptolemaic and the Greek period than we do say in earlier, but it is there too. It is there too. We do find exorcism texts. If you do want to read one on, say, Egyptian magic, Rittner's book is excellent, and it is freely available from the University of Chicago, the Oriental Institute. You can download the whole book, and it's 4th edition too. And it's really excellent. That's a really excellent book on Egyptian magic. I don't know if it gets into exorcism per se, but it might. So anyway, that's all I can tell you right now. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. The Chem Leopard for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Shalom Aleikum. Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Want to know your opinion on the Apocrypha, specifically Maccabees. Should it be read for historical context or to fill the gap? Okay. My opinion about the Apocrypha is that it's not inspired. Okay, it's not the Bible. It's not inspired text, even though the Council of Trent did declare it to be Catholic scripture. But I do not think it's the inspired word of God. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have historical or say cultural merit. I do think, particularly Maccabees. Maccabees does give us some historical context that we don't find anywhere else, and I think that is particularly useful, especially if you want to get into the Hasmonean period. Very, very interesting at that. And the Maccabees does show us the basically it's a primary source for the rebellion against the Seleucids. So I think it's very, very it's absolutely an essential source for that. However, it also has some stuff in there that's not so good too. So it isn't scripture, and nobody prior to, say, the Council of Trent really sort of viewed it as, say, the inspired. Like, you won't find it in, say, the early canons of the Christian Church. You'll find it mentioned from time to time, but you won't find it as being, say, basically mentioned in the same way you find, say, pagan sources. You don't find it in lists of canonical literature like Victorian canon or that, or even the Council of Orange. So, so you won't see it as being sort of authoritative, but it is valuable, and it's worth a read. It's definitely worth reading, but it's not worth reading as scripture. So, again, I highly recommend the Apocrypha, but I also recommend other books too. I also recommend reading, say, pseudepigrapha. I also recommend reading pagan literature. I read broadly. Absolutely read broadly. In fact, the more you read, the more informed you'll be. So I'm a huge, as I say, my biggest regret in doing a YouTube channel is I don't have enough time to read. Because before I started my YouTube channel, I was like stuffing my head with everything I could read. And I really, really wish I had, like, at least one day a week to just read. I wish that. I would love that. But, I have to sort of sneak in my reading as time permits, and is not the same. So definitely read the Apocrypha. It's interesting. It's like the New American Bible, which is a Catholic Bible, has a very, very good translation, in my opinion, of the Apocrypha. So I would actually highly recommend it. It's a great read. So anyway, there's my opinion. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Matthew Harrell for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Is Kadesh Barnea named after the Egyptian god Katesh? No. Also, will you please put Exodus 24 and Revelation 5:3 in context, that they refer to things being under the earth and the water? Okay. I'll answer the first one. Okay. It's not Kadesh Barnea is not actually named after Katesh. There's a very, very compelling argument that's been just recently proposed that Kadesh Barnea actually it comes from Kadesh Banare, which happens to be the one of the throne names of Merneptah. So it's a very, very compelling argument here that there's a connection here between Kadesh Barnea and King Merneptah. So it most likely it's named after that king of the 19th dynasty, that Egyptian king of the 19th dynasty. Hey Han, can you look up yeah, what is that question? Because if it's too technical, I want it. I'm all right. Sorry, Matthew Harrell. Magnum Opus. I noticed you put a thing. I assumed my question was too specific because you skipped over it. Sorry about that. If it was a super chat, we didn't mean to skip over it. If it wasn't, I didn't see it, but I love technical questions. So if it's, in this case, post it again because I didn't see it. So sorry about that, Matthew. Yeah, we don't see your question in there. So, okay, back to Matthew Harrell's question. So, yeah, so Kadesh Barnea is probably named after Merneptah. Now, Exodus 20, Revelation 5:3. Now it showed up? Is it? Okay. The whole idea of Exodus 24, and I'm going to actually put up Exodus. Verse 4. Okay. I'll start verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an idol in any likeness of what is in heaven above, in the earth beneath, or in the waters underneath the earth. Okay. This is basically just sort of a way of saying anywhere. The idea is that that you have the heavens above, the earth underneath the heavens, and underneath the earth was sort of the primordial waters that the earth sat upon. Essentially 4 pillars that suspended the earth above the waters underneath the earth. The idea here is that the underworld was a watery place. Now, this sort of kind of view, this sort of is different than, say, our view of, say, Hades or hell, which is a place of fire. Now, that is the lake of fire, but Sheol was associated with water. We see this in Jonah, where Jonah chapter 2, where he dies and he goes to the place of water under the mountains. So this is the idea that the grave is that watery depth place. So then when we go, say, to Revelation 5:3, 5, verse 3. And no one, verse 2. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open up the book to break its seal?" And no one in heaven or on the earth or under the earth was able to open the book or to look into it. So essentially, no one in heaven, on the earth, or basically under the earth in Sheol. So that is what's going on here. Is it means everything, everyone, every living thing. So no divine being, no deceased being, no living creaturely being. So that's what's going on here as far as the relationship between Revelation 5:3 and Exodus 24. And Revelation 5:3 is getting this turn of phrase from Exodus 20. So you've basically called it right here in connecting the two, because they are actually very, very closely linked. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And yes, I do see it. Okay. Sorry, Magnum. I didn't skip over it. We just hadn't gotten to it yet. So we didn't skip your question. We're just a little behind tonight because we've had a lot of good, really, really serious technical questions. So we're getting through this a little slower than we normally do, but we are getting there. We will answer all the super chats, guaranteed. Even if I'm here till midnight. Don't make me do that. Unless they're really, really generous super chats. Okay. And it's for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thoughts on the 2021 article from Jonathan Adler that argues Jewish people didn't generally follow kosher laws until the Hasmonean period? No. No. That's definitely not true. Already by 1150 BC, we are finding a change in faunal remains at various archaeological sites. Okay. The fact is that prior to, say, 1150 BC, we find lots of pig remains, donkey remains, wild game remains at archaeological sites in the Levant. Starting at around 1150 and perhaps earlier, 1150 is probably as close as we can name, because archaeology work. Starting in 1150 BC, roughly, could be 1180, but that's the estimate. We see this transition. We see already a sharp transition from, say, those non-kosher forms of diet to basically lamb or sheep remains, goat remains, cattle, of course. We start to see that we don't see any more, say, pig remains, or say ibis or donkey remains. Yes, donkeys are edible. People do eat them. I wouldn't say that it's exactly good eats. That's not. If it's like horse meat, it's not bad. We've actually had horse meat. I've eaten horse meat. It's actually quite edible. It's quite tasty, but it's not kosher. Not kosher. And neither is pig. Pig is also not kosher. So we do find that in certain cases that that there were following some kosher laws as early as the 12th century BC. So yeah, definitely they were following some kosher laws. Now, were they following these consistently? Were they following any of God's laws consistently? Were they committed monotheists? So, just because they didn't follow these things religiously didn't mean that the laws weren't there or that some people didn't follow them. So there does seem to be there's definitely archaeological evidence that they were following some of these. Now, were they following all of them? Probably not. And like for example, they probably weren't following, say, the eating shellfish in the same way as they were, say, staying away from pork. So they might have blurred the line sometime, and they might have not had the same interpretation of some of these laws that they later had on in the Hasmonean period. Like for example, the boiling a kid in its mother's milk. There's in many respects that there's sort of a literal interpretation of that, as well as sort of a more, say, broader interpretation of that. The idea is you don't go milk a goat and then boil the kid, which is the baby goat, in that milk taken from its own mother. There's something really barbaric about that, and they probably would have definitely had kept that kosher law in the narrow case. But the broader sort of application of that, where it's interpreted as being, well, mixing milk products and meat products, probably wasn't a interpretation that was, say, happening, say, in the 12th century, but would have definitely probably been much more in, say, Hasmonean or Talmudic periods. So, definitely, these laws are expanded over time. There's no doubt about it. But to say that they didn't follow it is just doesn't jive with the archaeological evidence that we have. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. We didn't skip you. We just hadn't gotten to you yet. So. As I said, it's a slower night tonight. It's a slower night. A lot of technical questions tonight. I'm actually thrilled about this. This is actually really, really exciting. It means our community is growing. It's getting more technical. This is fantastic. I'm loving this. This is great. And thank you very much for that question. Thank you very much for that super chat. Okay. The Camel Leopard for $5 again. Thank you very much. Are the feet of iron and clay in Nebuchadnezzar's vision the division of Rome into east and west? Could Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel be Nabonidus? That's an interesting question. They're both actually interesting questions. The first one is in a matter of interpretative prophecy. Now, the idea of the feet of iron and clay is the idea that you have bits of iron being held together by clay, which means that it's strong, but there's weakness here. There's weakness here. And it's many times it's been prophetically assumed that this is Rome. And the reason why it's often interpreted as being Rome is because Rome was really a collection of kingdoms and provinces that were really just held together by, say, the force of the Roman Empire, which wasn't always forceful. Rome, for all its sort of power, really had a lot of weakness to it, and lost a lot of battles and lost a lot of territory over time, and it sort of, expanded and contracted over time. So while it's sort of classical interpretive prophecy that this is Rome, just because the head of gold is basically, Nebuchadnezzar is told, this is your kingdom. This is your kingdom, the head of gold. That sort of sets the stage for then the the body of the torso of silver, the legs of bronze, and then the feet of iron. So each of those being a different king. So there's definitely that's definitely a classical way of interpreting. I don't have a better interpretation for it, so I'm fine with going with that. Now, your second question: could Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel be Nabonidus? I don't think so. I don't think they would have confused the two. So, I don't think that there's. I mean, I go with the early dating of Daniel, honestly. So I don't think it's Nabonidus, and I don't see a lot of reason. I mean, I know that there are scholars out there that go for a late dating of the Book of Daniel. I'm not one of them. I'm not one of them. There was a very good book that was written actually by Donald J. Wiseman, J.J. Martin, Kenneth Kitchen, and several others that came out of a Tyndale House conference on I think it's called The Dating of the Book of Daniel or something like that. It's a very good book. It's excellent. And it raises a lot of these issues. It tries to seriously engage. So it's out of print. I think it was published in the 60s, but I also haven't seen a lot of scholars engage what those guys did there. So I think there's actually a lot of a minority view scholarship here that has gone under the radar here and hasn't been seriously engaged by the majority view. So anyway, that's my opinion on this. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Maura Kerp for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. Leviticus 4:22-26 describes the sin offering procedure for rulers. What people do rulers refer to, given that there was no king at this time? Okay, let's pull that up. Or read the passage. Okay. Verse 22. When a leader sins and is unintentionally does one of all the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and he becomes guilty. If his sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring his offering, a goat, male without defect, and he shall lay his hand on the head of the male goat and slay it in the place where they slay the burnt offerings before the Lord. It is a sin offering. Then the priest is to take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar of the burnt offering, and the rest of the blood he shall pour at the base of the altar of the burnt offering. And all its fat he shall offer up in smoke on the altar, as is the case of the fat of the sacrifice of peace offerings. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him regarding his sin given. Now, the word here for leader is a nasi. Okay. Now, a nasi here can mean any sort of chief or prince. Okay. So it's not a king. It's not a melech. And melech being the Hebrew word for king. A nasi is something else. A nasi can be a judge. It can be a clan leader. It can be a tribe leader. It can be a bureaucrat. You know, it's very ambiguous here. It's not basically saying the king, but it's any sort of person in authority. And even at this time, when Moses is has to, he's leading people around, say, the wilderness, and he's basically, judging for every little dispute that's coming up. And his father-in-law comes up to you and goes, doing? What are you doing here? Judging every little squabble yourself? Delegate this. Make for yourself rulers of 100, rulers of 1,000, so that you don't and only judge the toughest cases yourself. So even while they're wandering in the wilderness, authorities are already being appointed to do some of the, administrative heavy lifting. So we do see that in already in the wilderness experience that they've had to, deal with the reality of, say, nation building here by having other, forms of authority. But we also know too that during the time of their wandering, it was still a clan society. There was still tribal leaders. Each of the 12 tribes had its leader. Each of those tribes was made of many clans, and each clan had its leader. So there were rulers. There was Nasi at the time of Leviticus 4, just not a king. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. And Matthew Harrell for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is the showbread meant for in the first temple, and why were the Levites allowed to eat food offered to God in Leviticus 21:2? That's 2 questions. Have you seen Attack on Titan? Yes, I have. I have to go to sleep now. Thank you and good night. Okay. In the first, the showbread. Now, the showbread isn't just in the first temple. It's also used in the tabernacle. And it's basically meant to be a bread, a loaf of bread that's put on the offering table and is always supposed to be there. And the only time you replace it is when you replace it with another loaf of showbread. It's essentially one of the ideas that we have from, say, the tabernacle rituals is that there has to be a perpetual offering on the altars at all times. Now, on the horned altars, this isn't a problem, because the horns and the horned altars are actually models of offerings. And we see this in say, horned altars that we find in Egypt, where they're essentially just shaped like ritual offering rolls. So that's the purpose of the altars. The horns on the altars is to be perpetual offering in the form of models. But you can't do that with the offering table, because the offering table has no horns. It's just a flat surface. So what they do in its place is they put on the showbread. So that's how they show a perpetual offering to the Lord at all times, is by having that showbread on the offering table. Okay? So that's the purpose of the showbread. Now, in Leviticus 21:22, all right, where it says in start verse 21, no man among the descendants of Aaron the priest who has defect is to come near to the Lord's offerings by fire, since he has a defect. He shall not come near the offering, near to offer bread of his God. He may eat, the priest may eat of the bread of his God, both the most holy and of the holy. Okay. Now, it is true that the Levites were allowed to eat a lot of the offerings, and that's part of their inheritance, is that they do get to eat of the holy food. And one of the reasons they got to eat of it is because they've got no share land. The Israelites, when the inheritance was divided up, Each of the 12 tribes got a share of the land, except the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi got no land. They got cities, but they didn't get a large provincial swath of land, like, say, the tribe of Dan or the tribe of Asher or Judah. So the Levites basically subsisted outside in these Levitical cities through religious services that they had to offer. Now, in the case of, say, the local Levites of a town, they would be provided by the other people of the town, who would then contribute food to support the Levites, provide religious services. In the temple, they got a share of the offerings. Essentially, anything that wasn't completely burnt up was could be eaten by the Levites. For example, the boiled meat, a Levite could stick a fork in, grab a random piece, and then was allowed to eat. And now, he couldn't throw that meat back in if he didn't like the cut. He couldn't be picky. Was not allowed to be picky. Whatever stuck to that fork is what he ate. Okay. But they were also allowed to eat some of the grain offerings. They were also allowed to eat some of the, say, the holy bread. So this was allowed. This was absolutely allowed for Levites. And the reason was because they didn't get a share. They didn't get a share in any other way. So that is part of their inheritance when God says, the Levites shall have no land because God shall be in his inheritance. And that's part of it, that the food offered to God goes to the Levites and the priests. So that answers your two serious questions. Now, have you seen Attack on Titan? Yes, I have. I have seen the first 2 seasons. I have not seen season 3. So I have yet to still see season 3, but I have seen the first 2 seasons. It's interesting. It's very well animated. It's very strange. It's very strange, and it's not in my favorites. I did like it, but it's not in my top list of favorite anime. For anyone who don't know what Attack on Titan is, it's an anime that takes place on the moon Titan, and they're essentially living this medieval existence and are being attacked by these giants. These sort of giants without any skin on them. Just attack and eat. So it's a very interesting concept for an anime, but it's not my favorite. I'll have to admit. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Ryan Naylor for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. If we accept Kitchen's argument that the Persian loanwords in Daniel are old, how early are you willing to date the Book of Daniel, at least partially? I would date at least partially the Book of Daniel to the 6th century, 5th, 6th century BC. So that's where I would ballpark Daniel. Now, is it all that old? I can't say. I haven't looked at the text critical issues enough in Daniel. I am very uncomfortable with the idea, though, in Daniel that there's prophecies that herald to the Greek period. Therefore, it's ex eventu prophecy, which means it's prophecy written after the fact. So I'm very, very uncomfortable with that particular interpretation. And the reason I'm very, very uncomfortable with that interpretation is because even ex eventu prophecy is often recontextualized. So for me, it's very problematic to try to date Daniel to the Hellenistic period when we know that there are much, much older prophecies that are recontextualized and are much older, like we find in Ezekiel. So, yeah, I've got real concerns about how that methodology is done with redating of Daniel. I'm just not buying it. I'm just not buying it. Because it seems to be it's a double standard. You know, they're applying one standard to Daniel and different standard to other books. And part of the reason they're applying it to Daniel is because it is a very, very incredible prophecy. So I've got some issues with Daniel, how Daniel's redated like that. So as I said, I would date it to the 5th, 6th centuries BC, and really I lean more towards the 5th. So yeah, so that's really where I sort of sit with that. But unless I start looking more at the textual details, I can't give you more detail than that. As I said, there is a very good book on the dating of Daniel, which I highly recommend. All right, so thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Anthony Rougier for $5. Good to see you tonight, friend. He says, have you seen the new preliminary report from Joseph Garfinkel's new excavation at Lachish? It is in AJA. The man is on the roll with his excavations. I have not seen that new excavation at Lachish. But he does do very good work. I'm very much impressed with Garfinkel's work. I think he's a very good excavator. I think he's a very responsible excavator. It's actually quite refreshing to see somebody who doesn't have necessarily an ideological axe to grind apply that to the archaeological field. So I will see if I can find that excavation report and see what it says. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate that. Okay. Inferno for $1.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Caught you on my break. May our triune God bless you. Well, may our triune God bless you also. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. I'm glad you caught us on your break. What a great way to spend your break is with us. I'm very much honored. I very much appreciate everyone who contributes to us through the super chats. We wouldn't meet expenses without you guys. We really appreciate all the support you give us. We appreciate your prayers. We appreciate all the financial support. We really appreciate the good wishes, because you know, there are times when it can be very demoralizing to do this kind of work. So very much appreciate the support, and I'm so glad you were with us tonight. Thank you so very much. Okay, Amir Eshafra for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. I recently came across a person claiming that the seed of God resides in us from the Greek sperma, meaning sperm. Thoughts? Oh. I've been doing some work recently with people who are involved with the Valley of Healing, which is sort of a Gnostic cult, run by Michael Petro, and he very much has this view that that the Greek sperma, meaning sperm, it's an anachronistic fallacy. It's really an anachronistic fallacy. Now, the Greek sperma comes from the word meaning seed. But the thing is, it's not specific to gender. It's not specific to gender. So it's not, you don't only see this applied to men, it also applies to women. It just really means seed. That's really what it means. The Greek sperma really just only means seed. So it can refer to the seed of the man, but it can also refer to the seed of the woman. And we wouldn't say that's sperm. We get into trouble when people start using what's called anachronistic etymology. And this happens actually more often than a lot of people care to admit. Like, for example, you'll often sometimes hear the sermon goes, well, dynamos. Where we get the word dynamite from. Dynamos means power, explosive power. You know, so when the Bible says dynamos, it means to have this explosive, violent power, just like dynamite. Makes an exciting sermon. Unfortunately, it's an anachronism. Dynamos in Greek only means to be able to do something. Okay? It doesn't actually have the connotation of being explosive or having that kind of a power. It only means you can do it. You have the ability to do it. That's it. There's no force or explosion or anything, any nonsense like that. That is a connotation that's been added anachronistically with the invention of dynamite in the 19th century by Nobel. Prior to Nobel's invention, nobody ever thought that was the meaning of dynamos. In the same way, you know, prior to the microscope, nobody really connected sperma to the idea of sperm or DNA, if you want to get even more ludicrous, like I've seen sometimes. You know, these are anachronisms that comes with a scientific revolution that are being grafted back into the text. Now, it can mean sperm in the sense of that this is the seed of the man. Okay? So it can mean that. But it doesn't only mean that, and that's the problem. It doesn't only mean that. Because as I said, we have also text where it says the seed of the woman too. Yeah. So, those are my thoughts on this. That we have to be very careful here that we're not invoking the anachronistic fallacy when we do etymology, because it can lead us down in the wrong conclusion. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Kenneth Vaughn for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. What do you think of the criticisms accusing the documentary hypothesis of anti-Semitism? Namely, that it impugns Jewish rituals and their guiding values. Wow. This gets ugly, honestly. And it gets ugly. It gets ugly because there's a history there. There is a history, especially among German higher criticism of anti-Semitism. I don't think that the documentary hypothesis is anti-Semitic per se. But it was held by many people who were very anti-Semitic. One of the things we kind of have to understand that during World War II, while, say, New Testament faculties in under Nazi Germany were basically, many of the New Testament faculties in universities were purged because of upstart preachers. The Old Testament faculties oftentimes were left completely untouched. And there was this conversation, I believe it was by Commandant von Harnack, which is German theologian, and Harnack was basically in conversation with you've done this to, say, Testament faculty. Well, why aren't you doing the same thing to the Old Testament? We're studying the Bible here. And the Nazis said to Harnack, well, you believe exactly what we believe. Yeesh. Ick. That's a terrible indictment. Terrible indictment. And basically a lot of, say, the scholars that survived retaining their academic posts during World War II were ideologically the same as, many of National Socialist leadership. So, I'm not going to go as far as to say that the documentary hypothesis itself is anti-Semitic. I don't think it is. I think it's wrong. I think it's condescending. I do think it tries to foist an idea that Jewish ritual and their history is a fiction. Okay, I'll go that far. I won't say it's anti-Semitic, though, but it is tied to a lot of people who were rabidly anti-Semitic. Is that guilt by association? Yeah, probably. And it's probably guilt by association. But it does have a very, very ugly history, too. And I know a lot of scholarship today tends to whitewash it, but I think it's also healthy to acknowledge that this history of it as well. So I won't go as far as to say that the theory is anti-Semitic, but boy, there's a lot of overlap. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. RG Strategy for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. It is one of those opinion questions, laugh out loud. Yeah, those are the ones that get me in the most trouble. Thank you very much. What are your thoughts on the discovery at Abu Sir of the mummification tool cache found by Egyptian and Czech Egyptologists? From time to time, mummification caches are found. There was a mummification cache found about 6 or 7 years ago in Kings Valley at the tomb that they've now designated as KV64, which is basically a long shaft tomb that was really just filled with mummification implements, jars, vast swaths of linen, some mummification tools. It didn't contain a burial. There was no burials there. It was just a cache of mummification stuff. And from time to time, they do find these. They find various mummification tools and supplies, jars of natron, etc. So it's not that uncommon. It's not that uncommon to find these. But I'm not aware of the one particular at Abu Sir, but I know of others. There's other mummification caches that have been found. And I don't think unless they found something very spectacular, I don't think it'll change too much of our opinion on what happened with mummification. But yeah, we do get these from time to time. They do happen fairly often. Even Davies in the 19th century, Theodore Davies, he discovered a mummification cache too. So it happens. We do find these. So, time to time, we do find them because, that's what happened to a lot of these after, people were buried. Essentially, the way that mummification often worked was they would set up a tent. They would mummify the body under this tent. And then they'd take the extra supplies and, they're dedicated for royal burials. So what they did was they just then buried them, nearby. So it's probable that, for example, in the case of KV64, that was probably the burial cache that was mummification cache that was probably used for King Tut's burial in KV62, because it's really, really close. KV62 and KV64 are really, really close to each other. So it doesn't surprise me that they've found mummification cache at Abu Sir. There was a lot of burials done. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. It's an interesting question. Okay. Camo leopard for $2. Could akkad in Shema mean alone instead of one? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Ahad. I think one is a better translation there. I really do. He's talking. The question here has to do with the great Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one or alone. I don't. It's possible. It's possible it could mean alone, but Ahad is probably. I think it's probably the better. Because there's something here that alone would not make sense. And basically the whole idea, if we were dealing with, say, for example, a unitary monotheism. Now, there's a difference between, say, unitary monotheism or something's called monolithic. Better way of saying monolithic monotheism versus monarchic monotheism. They're both forms of monotheism, but they have a different metaphysics. And the idea of, say, for example, monolithic monotheism is that you have a single identity of God and then the creation being. There's no angels, no demons, no small gods running around, no powers or principalities or any of that. There's none of that with monolithic monotheism. And I think if you translated that alone, that would imply a monolithic monotheism. Whereas if it was one, that leaves the door open for, say, monarchic monotheism, which does seem to be more in line with, say, the rest of Scripture. So I think very much in this case, I think one is the better translation here. Because the context seems to imply monarchic instead of monolithic. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. It's an interesting translational note. But I do think one's the better choice here. So thank you very much. Okay. Moise Salazar again for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. Is it true that in the Table of Nations, the Mycenaean lineage appears Dorian stock? Please explain. I think that is remarkable. Okay. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. I don't know if I don't have my Table of Nations memorized off the top of my head. So unless you have a Bible verse for me to look at per se, I can't say for sure. Again, this is one of those areas that I do need to do more research on, but I haven't actually hit done. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if the Table of Nations did include this, because these are regions that were known in the ancient world. So, Mycenaean are a nation that was known to the ancient Levantines. Trade had been going on between Levantine cultures and Mycenae for millennia. Absolutely. I mean, it goes way back. like for example, we find Mycenaean ware all through the Levant. That dates all the way back at least to the Middle Bronze Age, if not early Bronze. So absolutely, there is a whole lot of trade going on between Levant and Mycenaean. So it really wouldn't surprise me if they do appear in the Table of Nations, but I can't say off the top of my head without, say, a more precise reference, or having to possibly do the research myself to find. So I can't answer you more on this because that's a complicated question and that would require more investigation here. So I can't answer it more than that. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I do appreciate it, and that's probably as much as detail as I can give you at the moment. But we do, as I said, Mycenaean ware all through the Levant, going back to, as I said, Middle Bronze or earlier. So anyway, yeah, absolutely, they would have known about the Mycenaeans. So anyway, thank you for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, and so far, I think this is the last super chat for the moment, which is from 1000 Clever Boy for $7.77. Whoa, what an interesting number. Huh? Love the amount. Very interesting. You are a clever boy. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. What are the best Egypt documentaries available while streaming, especially concerning Bible backgrounds? Thank you for your work. Blessings. Wow, that's a really, really good question. I don't actually watch a lot of documentaries on the Bible, honestly. I have had a lot of difficulties with documentaries accurately portraying Bible history. They tend to be too extremes, and I maybe this is just the nature of televised media. I don't know. You get, on the one hand, the super skeptical approaches to the Bible that you find, for example, the Joel Baden's, the Francesca Stravolica, or whatever. You have that extreme sort of hyper skeptical fringe in documentary. But then you get the hyper fundamentalist fringe, the patterns of evidence crap. Or say the Leonard Mollers, just garbage on that end too. And they're both extremes are garbage. Both extremes are garbage, but they're garbage in their own mutual way. They're mutual exclusive garbage. The problem with finding a good documentary, especially concerning biblical backgrounds, is finding something that's not on both extremes. Something that takes the evidence as it's, at, face value. At the same time, too, treating the Bible as if it wasn't composed by idiots. Having respect for the ancient texts, as well as the archaeology. And it's sort of a middle position that's really, really difficult to find in documentaries. And frankly, it's difficult to find on YouTube. This is one of the reasons why we've done this channel, is because this information isn't out there. It's not available. It's always that one liberal extreme or that one fundamentalist extreme. And that middle ground just is absent. It's just maybe it's just the nature of the medium. Maybe it's the nature of what is it? Just really hard. So I mean, I don't have a great recommendation. Now there are some actually good. To be honest, there's a couple docudramas. One docudrama that comes to mind that I think is really, and let me see if I can find it here. It's on the it's actually not on the biblical backgrounds, but it is on the discovery of Tut's tomb. King Tut's tomb, and I think it was actually excellently done. I can find this here quickly. I hope I can. But it came out it came out within, I think, the last 10 years. Just take me a moment. The squirrels are spinning up my NAS here. It's just simply called Tutankhamun, and it was done in 2016. It is a 4-part documentary, docudrama, where it sort of shows Howard Carter in a dramatic reenactment, Howard Carter's discovery of the tomb of King Tut, and basically some of the stuff and the politics behind it. It does it great. It really sort of pegs Lecoq as sort of this sort of nefarious French pompous idiot, which he was. I mean, Lecoq was very much a pompous idiot. He's a stuffed shirt, really. I mean, Lecoq was a brilliant Egyptologist, but he was a French aristocratic pompous idiot. It shows Wente as being this sort of aloof presence. It even has a Neville in there, or not Neville, Petrie. It shows Petrie in there. So it gives you a really, really good insight into sort of the characters that went into the early history of Egyptology in the 1920s. I mean, it's fascinating. It's a great docudrama. It's not really a documentary. It is a docudrama, but it's actually one of the better ones I've seen, honestly. As far as that, I don't have a recommendation though, as far as anything down on Bible backgrounds. Not from a visual documentary. So anyway, that's the only recommendation I have at the moment. If I do ever find something, I will be sure to mention it. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, that is the last of the super chats. Okay, we are going to take some non-super chats because we got a little time left. Okay, really, we're already in overtime, but you know, we're not at 2 hours, 2.5 hours yet, so so I will take a few non-super chats, especially fun ones. Okay. Someone the person. Question: what is your favorite Chinese food? My favorite Chinese food is actually hot pot. There's a local Kongi house that's really near me that does this all meat hot pot. They also do a hot pot that's oysters as well, which is just absolutely delicious. Now, you have to kind of understand that I am on a ketogenic diet for my diabetes. Okay? So I can't eat a lot of carbohydrates. So for me, I've had to change my the kind of Chinese food I can eat. I used to be all into, say, the chow mains. I used to be into the fried rices. I used to love the lemon and orange chickens, all that sugary stuff. I can't eat any of that anymore. My pancreas is caught. My mouth was writing checks my pancreas couldn't cash. So so I've had to sort of switch to mostly fat and meat. So I found that I can eat Chinese hot pot, and I love it. It's absolutely delicious. I don't eat it with rice. I just eat straight the pot, and absolutely delicious. So it's now my favorite Chinese food. So thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate that. Okay. Swiftsea, asks, what are some book recommendations for trying to understand the New Testament use of Old Testament for beginners? Oh. I don't know. I'm not a New Testament scholar, so I don't actually have a good recommendation here. Carson once did a book. He co-authored it with another on talking about, say, the Old Testament in the Book of Revelation. I haven't read that book. I don't know how good it is, but I know he wrote a book on this, and I think there's been other people who've done stuff as well. Brent Strawn might be an author to look at. Now, he's not a New Testament scholar, but he's an Old Testament scholar that often does a lot of work on tying the Old Testament to the New Testament. So he's looking at it from the other way. So taking the Old Testament and saying, no, this is the reading that's being done. So Brent Strawn might have a good work on this. Like he did a very good book once called The Old Testament is Dying, which is a work on how modern preaching is ignoring the Old Testament and becoming more Marcionite in tone. So if Brent Strawn has written something on this, and I can't imagine him not doing it, it would be very good. So I don't have a specific recommendation for you here, but I'm sure somebody has done this. So let's see what else. Interesting. I'm going to... Okay, Marcy Powell here asked the question. Would Israel have been able to travel from Ramses to Yam Suf in a night? Google Maps makes seem a little... No. They would not have been able to go from Ramses to Yam Suf in a night. And the reason why is they sort of take a circular route. They're actually going from Ramses to Sukkoth, which is Cheku in the Wadi Tumilat. Then they hit Pithom, which is Paratum, also in the Wadi Tumilat. And they're camping along the way here. Then they go out of the Wadi Tumilat and then they north to the Yam Suf. Okay? So they're not taking a direct route, even if they could, which they can't because there's a marsh in between. So they can't they have to take this circular route. So they're not making it in the night. And now, the question then is, what does it... I know where this question is stemming from. And it is stemming from, and I'm going to... This question is stemming from... over. Okay, it's verse 51 here. And it's talking about here about the Passover in Exodus 12. And this question often arises out of verse 51. And it came about on that same day that the Lord brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. Okay. The problem here is the translation. That same day. Okay. The problem is the word same. And the word in Hebrew, it's sem. It's more along the lines of an etsem is the the word etsem means bone. It's actually an idiom. It's can mean same, but it means the substance, the very bone, the essence, the very is sometimes how it's on that very day is how it's sometimes translated. It doesn't actually, this is not actually meaning that the Lord brought Israel out of the land in one day, out of Egypt, out of the borders of Egypt in one day. It's not meaning that. What it's meaning is that same day is referring to the Passover day. Because this is an instruction on how to celebrate Passover and how the first Passover was celebrated. It's not actually chronicling the departure from Egypt. And a lot of people get that confused when they read Exodus 12. So it's not saying that it's the Israelites have, they're in Pir Ramses and they're at the Red Sea the next day. It's not saying that. And it's not even saying that they exited Egypt's border in one day. What it's saying is that the reference here to that same day is to the Passover, how it's out on the very day of Passover. God freed his people. So it's more the beginning of the journey is on the Passover or the day of the Passover. So that's what it means. Because remember, Jewish day is celebrated from evening to evening. So what's happening is that there's evening. The Passover happens at midnight, so that's when the firstborn are all struck dead. Then in the morning, they get, before the dawn breaks, Moses gets the message from Pharaoh, get out. So it's in the middle of the night, when he gets the message to get out of town, get out of Dodge. Okay? In the morning, they all gather to meet. They all gather to leave. So if it was the very same day, they now have 12 hours to essentially walk all their sheep, walk all their livestock, walk the old and the infirmed out of Egypt. Okay? So it definitely does not mean that they escape the borders of Egypt in the same chronological day, the same sort of 24-hour span of period. It does not mean. It is here definitely talking about the very day of Passover itself. So we have to be very, very careful here of how we read this, because it's too easy to get locked into a certain reading and say not consider other readings. So anyway, that's a great question. We get it fairly often, but it confuses people. It does really confuse. And sometimes it even confuses smart people who should know better. So thank you very much for that question. It's an interesting question. And let's see. Any others? Scan for some more here. I'm going to take here Jacob Testis question. Hey, Mr. Falk. Dr. Falk, please. This is fine. How should we interpret Genesis 1 through 11? Through findings of modern science. Well, we don't. Modern science is an anachronism. Genesis 1 through 11 is late Bronze Age literature. It didn't have a scientific understanding. It's mythohistory. It's mythohistory set within the context of temple ritual. So we don't try to interpret Genesis 1 through 11 through the findings of science. We try to interpret it through its context. Its context is through ancient Bronze Age literature. You can't possibly try to do it through science. It's just, you'll get some nonsense if you try. So you don't try to you try to read it according to its mytho-historical context. And that's the only way you can rationally read Genesis 1-11 and still come out with something coherent. We have to but we have to do this with all literature. And this is not just Genesis 1. All literature has a context. All literature has to be read according to its historical and its literary context. And if you don't read it according to its historical and literary context, you get a mess. You get a mess. So, modern science has contributed a lot of things, but I don't think this is something that we can directly apply or graft onto Genesis. It's then the fact is too, modern science changes. So it's always dicey when you try to just through a lens of modern science. It's always going to be dicey. So anyway, thank you for the question. This one here from Cataract 3. What is the creepiest story from Egyptian sources on necromancy? They didn't actually. There weren't a lot of creepy. There's not much in creepy stories on necromancy from Egyptian sources, honestly. Part of the reason why it's there you don't get creepy sources from Egyptian necromancy is because talking to the dead was considered to be normal. You have to understand that people talking to the dead in the rest of Levant and in Mesopotamia was considered weird. It was weird and unnatural, really weird and unnatural. In Egyptian culture, talking to the dead was normal. It was normal. It was really normal. During the festival of the valley, families would make a picnic basket, go to the tombs of their ancestors, eat a picnic lunch, and then talk with the dead. Hey, how's it going, Dad? In a culture that normalizes talking with the dead, you don't get this taboo on necromancy. But then again, too, at the same time, too, there also wasn't any attempt to predict the future through talking to the dead. And some of this comes down to, say, the Egyptian mindset. In Levant and Mesopotamia, people practiced necromancy with the belief that you could predict the future by talking with dead people. For some reason, the dead people know the future. How that works, I don't know. But in say, Egyptian society, Egyptian culture, there wasn't this same attempt to try to predict the future, except in a few, say, prophetic literatures of the Middle Kingdom. Part of the reason why is because, say, in Egyptian culture, everything was working right in that everything stayed the same. So the idea that they had this sort of idea of a cyclical eternity. Everything is operating normally because nothing changes. Nothing changes. Everything stays the same. So what you've had, say, in Egyptian view was, well, everything is normal. Everything remains the same for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It really didn't, but that was sort of the Egyptian mindset, is everything's normal, nothing changes. Change is bad. So people didn't go and try to predict the future because they didn't want to know about change. They wanted to know everything's the same. So, people didn't seek out trying to predict the future. although there were some curious kings who did. So you didn't get necromancy in the same way as you did less than Levant. Now, there are creepy stories in Egyptian culture. There are some stories about, demons being entrapped and all that. So there are some creepy stories. I think probably the closest thing is Papyrus Westcar has some very interesting spiritual tales, especially with the maiden in the box. Very, very, where she traps a demon in a bag, puts it in a box, puts it in another box, tells the master that she's trapped a demon in a box, and they think she's a witch and kill her. It doesn't end up good for her, but but it does sort of open up the question that you can say trap spirits in this way. So there's some interesting metaphysics going on there too. But you don't find a lot of ghost stories because, again, people believe that spirits are everywhere. Spirits are everywhere. Spirits of the dead are everywhere. Demons are everywhere. Lesser gods are everywhere. So, again, necromancy isn't a thing in Egypt because it's everyone's doing it. It's normalized. So anyway, interesting question. Thank you very much for the question. I see we have another super chat here from Converse Contender. Good to see you tonight, Will. Glad you could make it. For $4.99, thank you very much for the super chat. What is the ancestor story of the Egyptians? Like the Abraham story to the Hebrews? Love the show. Well, thank you very much. I'm so glad you could make it tonight. They did have an idea that they did have preserved king lists. They did believe that going back in time to, say, the first kings of Egypt, they don't have, the Egyptians didn't keep records of all the kings of Egypt, say, really early on. We do have records of, say, them on the Palermo stone, but that the Palermo stone does not seem to have been retained in, say, the cultural memory of Egypt. But before, say, the first kings of Egypt, they also thought that the gods, especially this is true, say, starting in the Middle Kingdom onward, that the gods preceded the kings of Egypt as kings of Egypt. So you'll have, like, the god Seth reigning for 5,000. And then before him, you have the god Horus who reigns. And then the big god Re reigning for 50,000 years. And then prior to that is the creation. So they don't have a ancestor story in the same way as the as the Israelites did. They do have, say, a mythological origin story. Now, when we talk about origin stories, this is something that's really interesting. This is really interesting. Because one of the things about origin stories is it's sometimes called the criteria of embarrassment. Is, how much do you know about the origins of your people is sort of inversely proportional to how mythological it is. Okay? In really, really old cultures, like the Egyptians, like the Chinese, origin stories tend to be highly mythologized. The origins tend to go back to the gods. The origin story of the Hebrews is very specific. It has a lot of details. It comes down to real places, real names. It's a origin story of humble origins. Abraham's a sojourner. He's a hapiru. He's a bum. He's a bum. And this is not something that you really sort of want your your ancestry to come from. I mean, people tend to think, okay, I come from an ancestor of kings. People to think that you come from the best of stock. No, the Israelites come from an origin of lowly people, wanderers, outcasts, slaves in Egypt. When we look at, say, the various origin stories of across the globe, those that have the most specific details of the humblest origins tend to be most likely true. And this is what some historians sometimes call the criterion of embarrassment. Like, for example, we all accept the origin story for the United States. I mean, not only is it documented, but, it's got criteria that, hey, they were a British colony. They're subjected to the King of England, and they rebel. Well, really, the Parliament of England, but they rebel against the king, okay, and they have a revolution. So, the older culture is, the more likely it tends to have those more mythological trappings, like Egyptians having, their origin story being the gods were the kings, creation, and the gods were kings, and then you have the first king. Just like, for example, in the Chinese, you have a god, giving birth to the Chinese nation. You do get the logical origin story. So anyway, that's sort of the ancestor story of the Egyptians. It didn't have a real ancestor story in the same way as Israelites. But definitely it's an interesting question, because they're two, the origin stories of the Israelites and the origin stories of the Egyptians are in many respects diametrically opposite in their structure. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, and one by Converse Contender for $4.99. Again, thank you very much. Okay. Any Egyptian records of migrants become citizens that you know of? What's the bar besides marriage? Also, was women part of their husband's or father's house? Okay, that's 3 questions, and they're very, very different questions. So let's take these one at a time. Any records of migrants becoming citizens that you know of? Yes. Yes, there are. There is actually the Chancellor Bey, who not only starts off a slave, but he ascends every social strata above him to become chancellor, to become vizier of Egypt. Then he's executed. But that's because he tries to overthrow the king. But he's a citizen. He ceases to become a slave. He's emancipated as a slave and goes up the ranks. He becomes a scribe. He becomes an administrator. And he works his way to the highest office in the land. So yes, there are actually foreign slaves that do end up going very, very high up the ranks. Apparel, the vizier during the reign of Akhenaten, also was probably a slave. He was a Semite. He was a Semitic Levantine, and yet he also tends to make it all the way up to the top. And some of this, the reason why certain slaves do ascend the ranks very, very fast too, is because they're skilled labor. When the Egyptians conquered the Levant or did their policing actions there and took slaves back, they only took the best. They left the riffraff behind. They left the farmers behind. They didn't need more of them. But they brought in people who had skilled labor, metalworking, who could read and write. Reading and writing would be enough to get you put on a corvée back to Egypt to serve as a slave. So, now how you became emancipated as a slave was generally because whoever owned you saw you as essentially a worthwhile person, and freed you. Essentially, what they did was the way they freed you was they adopted you as a son, and once you were adopted as a son, you were given a writ of emancipation, and you were then allowed to choose your destiny. Now, sometimes how this worked is, in the case of, say, a widow, and we do have records of this happening, and this comes to your second question, is that sometimes a widow would have her inherit all her husband's slaves. All her husband's slaves. But she still needed a man around the house. So sometimes she would adopt a slave, give him a writ of emancipation, and marry him. So that happened. That was a thing. That was a thing in Egypt. So we do have both situations where, you know, somebody did it by merit, a woman did it by necessity, or just love. That happened too, strange as it sounds. So, you know, now your final question here is, also were women part of their husband's or their father's house? The whole thing about marriage in Egypt is a little odd. And part of it is because marriage was very much a revolving door in ancient Egypt. Essentially, the way marriage worked in Egypt is there was a betrothal, basically a contract to marry. So the husband's household, or usually his parents, sometimes he could do this on his own accord, would negotiate with the woman's house father or representative, uncle sometimes, and there'd be a marriage agreement. And the marriage agreements were pretty straightforward. These weren't much, but they usually involve the man building a house. Once the house was built, he could go collect his wife, and then they would set up home in the house. Now, that actually didn't make the marriage permanent. At that point, they were married, but not permanent. The woman did not have inheritance rights yet, even though she was now part of the husband's house. She would not get inheritance rights until she produces the first child. Once she produces the first child, she gets inheritance rights. The marriage is permanent at that point. At least until there's a divorce. But once there's a divorce, then there's a different division of property. So the production of children changes the status of a woman in the marriage. Let's say, for example, she doesn't have children, and the husband dies. She only gets 1/3 of the property, essentially the part that she contributes. The idea in Egyptian inheritance law was that the woman contributes a third, the man contributes a third, and the husband contributes the house, which they considered also a third. So there's roughly this three-way split. The house being valued equivalent to the third of the rest of the household. So if she didn't produce children, the brother could come and claim the husband's third and the house. So a brother could come in and claim 2/3 of the inheritance, or the father of the husband could come and claim 2/3 of the inheritance, and she would only be left with her original third. If there's children, then the husband or the husband's parents or brothers are cut out at that point, and then the whole sort of inheritance things change. The wife still gets her third. She gets custodial control of the house, and the remaining husband's third goes to the children, which the wife also has custodial care of until the children are of age. So that sort of goes into sort of what marriage was like in ancient Egypt, and how the relationship between slaves and migrants who become slaves, and marriage and all that stuff. So citizenship wasn't really there wasn't like an official citizenship process. Like there wasn't, say, a document that said you're an Egyptian citizen. They were much more cognizant of class, and to a smaller extent ethnicity, but it's really more of a class society. Is really, say, an ethnicity society. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. We have taken a lot of questions today. One more. Okay, I'm going to take this one, and this will be the last question of the night because he's asked this a couple times. Catfrack3 says, why did Egyptian New Kingdom infantrymen fight barefoot? It seems tactically disadvantageous. Apologies if you've answered this one already. I haven't. The answer is they didn't fight barefoot. They wore sandals. Now, you don't see it on the illustrations. You don't see it on in the reliefs. And part of it is because that sandals are, very, very difficult to show on, but they wore sandals essentially, because they're having to march, through territories, roads that are of dubious quality. So they wore sandals, essentially open-toed sandals. So, and they fought in open-toed sandals. So, and these sandals were typically made of leather. There's a couple of examples that we find in that have survived. So we know that they didn't fight barefoot. They fought wearing sandals, and it just makes sense. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. I know you've asked it a couple times, and I did want to get to that. So with that said, that is going to be our last question for the night. I want to thank everyone who joined us and gave us super chats tonight. Very much appreciated. Those super chats really help us make ends meet and help us to pay our bills here. I also want to thank our Patreon supporters who don't get nearly enough thanks. Our Patreon supporters do help us, and they don't get the rewards, as I said, they deserve. But we appreciate that they are co-laborers with us in this ministry. And finally, I want to say, if you want to help us out financially, please consider donating to our efforts to get a book on the 10 plagues of Egypt out. And we had a GoFundMe. We still have that GoFundMe campaign, but we understand that a lot of viewers are reticent now, and understandably so, to use GoFundMe. And the best alternative we've come up with is to use cryptocurrency. And we've got addresses in the description for both a Monero XMR cryptocurrency and for Bitcoin. So if you want to donate to that fund, please consider using a cryptocurrency. So anyway, with that said, I want to thank you all for being with us tonight. This was a great set of questions. This was absolutely awesome. Phenomenal set of questions. This was probably one of the best sessions we had with questions. Just amazing questions with just demanding incredible detail. So anyway, I want to thank you all for watching tonight, and I will see you next week on Ancient and the Bible. Have a good night, everyone.